final days of King Henry VIII are often remembered as the decline of a once powerful monarch. But what most people don't realize is just how dark, grotesque, and horrifying his last years truly were. We're not talking about the glorious image of a commanding king on his throne, but of a man destroyed, ravaged by illness, paranoia, and the ghosts of those he had executed, including wives, friends, and even trusted advisors. Imagine a ruler so feared that no one dared tell him the truth, yet so physically ruined that he could barely walk, his body swollen, covered in festering sores, exuding the stench of death long before taking his final breath. Was he truly a brilliant strategist until the end, or merely a tyrant desperately clinging to the crown while the kingdom whispered of curses and divine punishment? The church called him the defender of the faith, yet he broke with Rome, executed those who opposed him, and left a legacy of blood that divided England for centuries. His obsession with power, succession, and betrayal shaped his downfall, and in his final days, he was surrounded not by loyal subjects, but by vultures waiting for the inevitable. Some historians claim he died tormented by visions, haunted by the wives he discarded and the enemies he sent to the stake. Others insist he was aware of every cruel decision until the very last moment. But the truth is far more disturbing than history books want you to believe. In this video, we will reveal the terrifying reality of Henry VIII's final days, the scandals, the paranoia, the grotesque decay of his body, and the shocking secret that marked his last moments. Before we begin, I need you to do something important. Click like, because this tells YouTube that content like this deserves to be recommended and seen by more people. Subscribe to the channel, because every week we uncover the hidden, dark side of history that is never taught in schools, and your support is the only reason we can continue. And during the video, leave a comment about what surprises you most. Was it the cruelty, the paranoia, or the repulsive way his own body turned against him? Watch until the end, because the final revelation about Henry VIII's death is so disturbing, so unexpected, that it will leave you completely speechless. At the dawn of June 28, 1491, while the sun still hid behind the mists that shrouded Greenwich Palace, he was born who would be remembered as one of England's most controversial kings, yet who, ironically, should never have inherited the crown. Henry, the second son of Henry VII, entered the world amidst celebrations still echoing from his father's victory in the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that had torn the English kingdom apart for decades, plunging noble families into bloodshed and betrayal. The Tudor dynasty emerged as a hope for stability, and every birth in the royal household was seen as a divine sign of continuity and power. However, Henry was not the chosen one to reign, and his childhood and youth reflect the life of a prince destined to serve in the shadows, to shine only as a support to his older brother, Arthur, the legitimate heir. He grew up surrounded by rigid protocols, instructed by tutors determined to instill in him the virtues of a prince of both the church and the court, as it was common for second sons to pursue ecclesiastical careers, strengthening the throne's ties with the clergy. From an early age, Henry proved himself cunning and endowed with insatiable curiosity. He learned Latin, French, and Spanish with the same ease with which he fell in love with music, poetry, and religious chants. The boy showed remarkable talent in classical studies, reciting passages from great authors, composing verses, and playing instruments such as the lute and the organ. His strong, harmonious voice echoed through the palace halls, captivating nobles who listened in admiration. But unlike Arthur, whose life was directed toward the strict preparation of a monarch, Henry enjoyed a rare freedom within the court. This freedom shaped his impetuous, vain personality, hungry for pleasure. While his brother was trained to rule with sobriety, Henry rode across the fields, hunted deer, participated in jousting tournaments, and practiced fencing with a passion that revealed his love for the spectacle of war and physical power. He had strong arms, an athletic body, and a magnetic presence that drew attention even from foreign diplomats who observed him as a youth. The court whispered that the secondary prince had more charisma and energy than the official heir. And many secretly wondered how England might be if the order of succession were reversed. At that time, however, destiny had been set, and Arthur would be king while Henry would fulfill only a supporting role, perhaps as a cardinal, bishop, or defender of the crown's interests in altars and monasteries. Henry's education was also shaped by fear. His father, Henry VII, was a distrustful man, marked by the scars of the civil war that had placed him on the throne. He was obsessed with preserving the newborn dynasty, watching his children's every step and imposing strict discipline. The princes were raised in separate wings of the palace, surrounded by carefully chosen servants and tutors, away from rival factions' influence. This atmosphere of surveillance and constant reminder of danger planted in Henry's heart a deep understanding of power's fragility and the necessity of defending it at any cost. Even as a boy, he learned that thrones are sustained not only with wisdom, but with strength and, if necessary, with blood. It was in this context that Henry developed his passion for tournaments, combat sports, and the grandeur of courtly ceremonies. He grew up watching his father use the pomp and splendor of the court as a political weapon to consolidate his image, and absorbed this lesson as if drinking from his mother's milk. The young prince was not only diligent in arts and letters, but also vain, aware of his beauty and the impact he had on people. He had fiery red hair, fair skin, and piercing eyes that conveyed confidence and authority even in youth. Foreign ambassadors reported a charming young prince whose presence rivaled that of any European king. Though not destined to rule, Henry displayed the haughtiness of one who believed himself touched by a greater destiny. This confidence, bordering on arrogance, was tempered by a passionate and impulsive heart, which would soon manifest in his loves, passions, and thirst for glory. The pivotal moment that changed the course of his life was the unexpected death of Prince Arthur in 1502. Henry was only 10 when his elder brother, heir to the throne and husband to Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon, succumbed to a sudden fever. The court plunged into mourning, but also uncertainty. Suddenly, the boy who had grown up as a supporting figure was thrust into the center of the main stage. The future of England now rested on his shoulders. His father, Henry VII, recognizing the importance of this twist of fate, redoubled the care and control over the young heir. Henry began to be molded with greater rigor to rule, receiving direct instruction in politics, religion, and military strategy. Yet, his previously free youth had left deep marks. Unlike his brother, educated with austerity, Henry carried with him a taste for pleasure, ostentation, and power as spectacle. At the same time, his new position placed him before a dilemma. He would need to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, to maintain the vital alliance with Spain. Even in adolescence, Henry was forced to understand that his personal life would never belong to him, that every gesture would have political implications, and that marriage would not be an act of love, but of power. During this transitional period, the young prince began to show signs of what would become his mark as king. A mix of irresistible charm, sharp intelligence, boundless vanity, and a brutal willingness to break rules when they did not serve his desires. He did not yet know it, but destiny had reserved for him not only the throne, but the responsibility of forever transforming the history of England. The prince who should never have reigned carried with him both the flame of cultural renaissance and the glory of tournaments, as well as the seed of tyranny and tragedy that would shape his final years. Thus, in Henry VIII's youth, amidst religious chants, poetic verses, and broken lances and justs, was forged not merely a king but a legend of splendor and shadow, of absolute power and inevitable ruin. When Henry VIII ascended the throne on April 21, 1509, he was only 17 years old, and all of England seemed to breathe a new air. As if after years of the rigidity and suspicion of King Henry VII, the court could finally open to the promise of a golden era. The young monarch was seen as the very image of vitality, youth and beauty. Tall, over 6 feet, with an athletic body honed by tournaments and hunts, fiery red hair that shimmered in the torchlight, and piercing eyes that inspired respect and desire. Henry was not just a king. He was the living portrait of a Renaissance hero, admired by nobles and commoners alike, revered by foreign ambassadors who returned to their kingdoms, describing him as a prince as handsome and vigorous as any sovereign in Christendom. His accession to the throne was celebrated with endless feasts, justs, and banquets, as the new king wanted everyone to notice the difference between him and his father. While the old Henry VII had been calculating, cold, and suspicious, young Henry VIII appeared generous, expansive, and a lover of pleasures and spectacle. The court became a theater of splendor. Music echoed through the corridors, tournaments were frequently organized, and the shine of jewels and tapestries competed with the sun itself. The people hailed him not only as a sovereign, but as a symbol of hope, believing that England was destined for a new era of glory. One of the first acts of his reign was marrying Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother Arthur. Catherine, daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, was cultured, pious, and politically strategic, and her union with Henry secured the alliance between England and Spain against continental enemies, particularly France. But beyond politics, there was also a personal bond between them. Henry admired Catherine's strength, devotion, and intelligence, even though his fiery youth often led him to seek other female company outside of marriage. At the beginning of his reign, Henry appeared to be a devoted husband, and the court was enchanted by the image of the royal couple as a mirror of virtue and unity. Yet behind this appearance, the young and seductive king was already showing signs of a restless personality, marked by vanity and a desire for affirmation. He liked to be seen as the ideal knight, not only wielding the sword in tournaments, but also displaying his skill in dances, singing songs he composed, and reciting verses blending faith and desire. The king was not only a ruler, but also an artist and athlete, a tireless competitor in justs, dressing in golden armor and flaunting his strength before his subjects. For chroniclers of the time, it seemed as if the legendary King Arthur himself had returned, bringing with him the promise of a strong and prosperous England. However, Henry's youth also made him impulsive and often reckless. Seduced by ideals of chivalry and honor, he constantly sought to place himself in a prominent position in wars and alliances. He nurtured a fierce rivalry with France and dreamed of conquering territories reminiscent of the glory of ancient kings. Yet behind military strategies, there was always the desire to be remembered, to be seen as a monarch greater than all others. The first years of his reign were marked by exuberant generosity. He reduced some taxes that had burdened the people during his father's time, freed prisoners, and distributed rewards to friends and courtiers. This liberality charmed the nobility, who came to see him not only as a king but as a patron, a man of great heart. However, the same generosity soon turned into extravagance, as Henry knew no limits for luxury and ostentation. Grand banquets were frequently held, tables filled with exotic meats, fine wines, and sweets arriving from overseas. The young king spent fortunes on gold-embroidered clothes, glittering jewels, and tournaments that cost more than military campaigns. The court became a stage of constant spectacle, and Henry, at the center of it all, shone like a star that would not admit a shadow. In personal matters, his fiery youth manifested in secret passions and discreet adventures. Although married to Catherine of Aragon, Henry could not resist the charm of the ladies of the court. His reputation as a seducer spread quietly through the palace corridors, and many whispered that the king's chivalrous virtues served as a mask for his carnal desires. Still, Henry maintained a public image of a Christian and devout prince, attending mass, supporting monks, and sponsoring translations of religious texts. This duality between faith and pleasure would mark his entire life. A king who saw himself as chosen by God, but who also indulged in the excesses of flesh and vanity. In his early speeches, Henry presented himself as a defender of justice, promising to protect his people and rule wisely. Indeed, in those first years, many saw in him a just sovereign attentive to the kingdom's needs. Yet his seductive youth also hid the seed of tyranny. Henry tolerated no contradictions and early on showed inflexibility in the face of any opposition, however slight. When counselors tried to moderate his spending or curb his military ambitions, the king reacted with fury, accusing them of treason or lack of faith in his divine mission. His court soon learned that behind the charming smile and magnetic gaze lay an explosive temperament and an iron will to impose his authority. Thus, the image of the young and seductive king was a mask that concealed both virtues and dangers. He embodied the Renaissance ideal of the prince: cultured, athletic, lover of the arts and war, generous and charming. But he also revealed early on his vanity, lust, and thirst for absolute power, which over time would transform him into a tyrant. During the first years of his reign, Henry VIII was celebrated in songs and poems as the star that would guide England to glory. But in the shadows of the court, whispers had already begun. How far would the thirst of this young monarch for pleasure, fame, and power go? Was he the ideal knight he seemed to be, or a prince dominated by passions that sooner or later would lead him to the abyss? This ambiguity marked the beginning of his reign, making Henry not only a young and seductive king, but also an enigma that fascinated and frightened at the same time. When Henry VIII ascended the throne on April 21, 1509, he was only 17 years old, and all of England seemed to breathe a new air. As if after years of the rigidity and distrust of King Henry VII, the court could finally open itself to the promise of a golden era. The young monarch was seen as the very image of vitality, youth, and beauty. Tall, over 6 feet in height, with an athletic body honed by tournaments and hunts, flaming red hair that shimmered in torchlight, and piercing eyes that inspired both respect and desire. Henry was not merely a king. He was the living portrait of a Renaissance hero, admired by nobles and commoners alike, revered by foreign ambassadors who returned to their realms, describing him as a prince as beautiful and vigorous as any sovereign of Christendom. His accession to the throne was celebrated with endless festivities, justs, and banquets, as the new king wanted everyone to perceive the difference between him and his father. If old Henry VII had been calculating, cold, and suspicious, young Henry VIII proved generous, expansive, and a lover of pleasures and spectacle. The court transformed into a theater of splendor. Music echoed through the corridors, tournaments were organized frequently, and the shine of jewels and tapestries competed with the sun itself. The people hailed him not only as a sovereign, but as a symbol of hope, believing that England was destined for a new era of glory. One of the first acts of his reign was to marry Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother Arthur. Catherine, daughter of Spain's Catholic monarchs, was cultured, devout, and politically strategic, and their union guaranteed the alliance between England and Spain against continental enemies, especially France. But beyond politics, there was also a personal bond. Henry admired Catherine's strength, devotion, and intelligence, although his fiery youth often tempted him to seek other female company outside the marriage. At the beginning of his reign, Henry seemed a devoted husband, and the court was enchanted by the image of the royal couple as a mirror of virtue and unity. Yet, behind this appearance, the young and seductive king already showed signs of a restless personality, marked by vanity and a desire for affirmation. He liked to be seen as the ideal knight, not only wielding the sword in tournaments, but also displaying his skill in dances, singing songs he composed himself, and reciting verses blending faith and desire. The king was not only a ruler, but also an artist and athlete, tireless in justs, where he wore golden armor and displayed his strength before his subjects. For chroniclers of the time, it seemed as if the legendary King Arthur himself had returned, bringing with him the promise of a strong and prosperous England. But Henry's youth also made him impetuous and, at times, reckless. Seduced by ideals of chivalry and honor, he constantly sought to place himself in positions of prominence in wars and alliances. He nourished a fierce rivalry with France and dreamed of conquering territories that evoked the glory of ancient kings. However, behind the military strategies, there was always a yearning to be remembered, to be seen as a monarch greater than all others. The early years of his reign were marked by exuberant generosity. He reduced some taxes that had burdened the people under his father, freed prisoners, and distributed rewards to friends and courtiers. This liberality delighted the nobility, who began to see him not only as a king but as a patron, a man of great heart. Yet the same generosity soon turned into extravagance, as Henry knew no bounds when it came to luxury and ostentation. Grand banquets were held frequently, tables overflowing with exotic meats, fine wines, and sweets imported from overseas. The young king spent fortunes on gold-embroidered clothes, dazzling jewels, and tournaments that cost more than military campaigns. The court became a stage for constant spectacle, and Henry, at its center, shone like a star that admitted no shadow. In personal matters, his fiery youth manifested in secret passions and discreet affairs. Though married to Catherine of Aragon, Henry could not resist the charm of the ladies at court. His reputation as a seducer spread quietly through the palace corridors, and many whispered that the king's chivalrous virtues served as a mask for his carnal desires. Still, Henry maintained a public image of a Christian and devout prince, attending mass, supporting monks, and sponsoring translations of religious texts. This duality between faith and pleasure would mark his entire life. A king who saw himself chosen by God, yet who also indulged in the excesses of the flesh and vanity. In his early speeches, Henry presented himself as a defender of justice, promising to protect his people and govern wisely. And indeed, in those first years, many saw in him a just sovereign attentive to the kingdom's needs. Yet his seductive youth also hid the seeds of tyranny. Henry did not tolerate contradiction, and from early on showed inflexibility toward any opposition, however slight. When advisors attempted to moderate his spending or curb his military ambitions, the king reacted with fury, accusing them of treason or lacking faith in his divine mission. His court quickly learned that behind the charming smile and magnetic gaze lay an explosive temper and an iron will to impose his authority. The image of the young and seductive king, therefore, was a mask that concealed both virtues and dangers. He embodied the Renaissance ideal of a prince, cultured, athletic, a lover of arts and war, generous and charming. But he also revealed, early on, vanity, lust, and a thirst for absolute power, which over time would transform him into a tyrant. Throughout the early years of his reign, Henry VIII was celebrated in songs and poems as the star that would guide England to glory. Yet, in the shadows of the court, whispers already formed. How far would this young monarch's thirst for pleasure, fame, and power go? Would he be the ideal knight he seemed to be, or a prince dominated by passions that sooner or later would lead him to the abyss? This ambiguity marked the beginning of his reign, making Henry not only a young and seductive king, but also an enigma that fascinated and frightened at the same time. Among the many kings who have occupied the throne of England, few were as enigmatic and contradictory as Henry VIII, a sovereign whose name still echoes today as synonymous with power, lust, tyranny, and controversy. This monarch was not merely a ruler, but a living stage of human contradictions. A man who declared himself a defender of the Catholic faith, yet soon broke with Rome to establish his own church, who preached loyalty and honor, yet whose love life was marked by scandals, voracious passions, and bloody separations, who proclaimed justice, yet had friends and long-time advisors beheaded with the same coldness with which he toasted at his banquets. His trajectory was thus filled with proclamations that at times elevated him as a demigod before his people, and at others exposed him as an incoherent tyrant who molded truth to his convenience. In his youth and in the early years of his reign, Henry VIII enchanted the court with his charisma. He was considered not only a seductive prince, but also a cultured ruler, a lover of the arts, music, and theology. In fiery speeches, he proclaimed himself a servant of the Catholic faith, a defender of the Church, and a mortal enemy of heresy. He received from Pope Leo X the title of Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, after writing against Martin Luther, vehemently denouncing the danger of Protestant ideas spreading across Europe. Yet it did not take long for his own passions to lead him to break the oath he had proclaimed before the Christian world. Henry's heart would not be content with obedience to Rome when his desires clashed with church rules. His frustration with his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had not given him a male heir, drove him to seek an annulment. And when the Pope refused, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The man who had once defended Catholicism thus became the architect of a schism that would forever mark English history. This was the first and perhaps most striking contradiction of his life. The defender of the faith transformed into the Pope's adversary. Henry's public declarations always reflected his ability to adapt to the winds of his own needs. In interviews and pronouncements to his court and subjects, his words oscillated between the sweetness of a protector and the harshness of a tyrant. On one occasion, he proclaimed himself chosen by God to lead England against the corruption of Rome and promised spiritual freedom to his subjects. Yet that freedom quickly proved a mask. For anyone daring to oppose his authority as the supreme head of the church was thrown into prison or to the scaffold. Bishops, monks, nobles, and even commoners who refused to swear loyalty to the king above the Pope faced the executioner's blade. Sir Thomas More, once his close friend and advisor, became a martyr for opposing royal orders. Henry, justifying the execution, coldly declared that no man, however holy, may defy the law of his king without paying the due price. In matters of relationships, his controversies were even more scandalous. The king who presented himself as an example of Christian virtue was also the same man who amassed wives, lovers, and intrigues. From Catherine of Aragon to Anne Boleyn, from Jane Seymour to Catherine Howard, each royal union was surrounded by rumors, contradictory statements, and justifications shaped to his convenience. When he wished to marry Anne Boleyn, Henry claimed that his union with Catherine was cursed by God, for she was his brother Arthur's widow. Later, when he grew tired of Anne, he accused her of treason and adultery, leading her to the scaffold with dubious charges and forged testimonies. Publicly, he defended his decision as an act of justice, but privately, he was often engulfed in paranoia and rage, fearing conspiracies at every corner. The king to whom love had once been sworn did not hesitate to destroy the lives of those who fell from his favor. Henry VIII's contradictions were not limited to religion and romance, but also extended to his politics and self-image. He desired to be seen as England's great protector, the father of his people, yet he raised taxes and drained the royal coffers in costly, often feudal wars against France and Scotland. He claimed to fight for England's honor, but amidst defeats and failed agreements, he earned more enemies than victories. At banquets and in proclamations, he declared that his mission was to elevate the kingdom's glory. Yet behind the scenes he was driven by an insatiable hunger for personal power, willing to sacrifice the stability of his nation for his whims and passions. Another controversial aspect was his stance on heresy and faith. While persecuting Catholics loyal to the Pope, he also did not tolerate radical Protestants who overstepped the boundaries he himself had set. Henry positioned himself as the supreme arbiter of faith. For him, only his interpretations were valid. This contradictory position created fear and confusion among his subjects, as no one knew which doctrine would be considered acceptable the next day. A man could be hanged for defending the Pope, and in the same year, another could be burned alive for supporting Protestant doctrines. Thus, the king rose as the absolute judge, proclaiming in fiery speeches that true faith is that which flows from the will of your sovereign. As he aged, his contradictions became even more evident. The man who had been a symbol of vigor and virility became an obese, sick monarch, tormented by chronic pain and festering wounds. Yet, in his final speeches, he proclaimed himself stronger than ever, as if challenging the very reality of his decaying body. He declared that his will remained unbreakable, that England was still guided by his firm hand, when in truth he was manipulated by advisors and surrounded by court intrigues. His reign ended as it began, surrounded by grand words, yet stained by cruel and contradictory acts. In the balance of his life, Henry VIII left a legacy of controversies, bold statements, and glaring contradictions. He was the man who claimed to defend the faith, yet destroyed the unity of Christendom in his kingdom. The passionate lover who turned his desires into public executions. The just king who ordered the killing of innocents to preserve his authority. The vigorous hero who ended as a feared and sick tyrant. In every word he spoke, in every decision he made, there was always a gap between what he declared and what he actually did. Perhaps it is precisely this contradiction that makes him so fascinating and so remembered centuries after his death. A king who embodied, in all his glory and misery, absolute power and the depths of the human soul. At the beginning of his reign, Henry VIII had been celebrated as the very embodiment of royal vigor. A radiant prince, endowed with extraordinary physical strength, beauty admired throughout Christendom, and an energy that overflowed both in the hunting fields and in the jousting tournaments. His presence dominated any room. His garments were cut from fine fabrics in vivid colors, and his muscles resembled those of a knight of legendary battles rather than a king confined to palaces. He was the sovereign who rode fearlessly, wielded the lance with skill, danced, and played instruments as if born to seduce not only his ladies, but an entire court intoxicated by his youth and exuberance. Yet fate, cruel and relentless, would show the world that the same man celebrated as the most athletic of kings would plunge into a terrifying decline, transforming into a monstrous shadow of himself. A body ruined, a mind consumed by pain, fear, and paranoia, and a grotesque figure whose flesh seemed to carry the curse of his own choices. Henry VIII's decline was not merely physical, but spiritual, political, and moral, a slow and painful process that became a spectacle for his court, a terror for his subjects, and a bitter lesson for posterity. Henry's vigorous youth had been marked by tournaments, hunts, and sports, but as the years passed, his health began to show signs of weakness. Some historians point to an accident during a tournament in 1536, when in the midst of a joust, the king fell from his horse and was crushed beneath it, remaining unconscious for hours. Chroniclers of the time reported this as a fatal turning point, after which Henry never fully regained his vitality. Old wounds reopened, his legs developed painful ulcers, and his mobility gradually diminished. The athletic king who once fascinated his subjects began to transform into a man tormented by chronic pain, unable to practice the sports he loved, increasingly surrendering to a life of indulgence at the table. His already lavish diet became uncontrolled. Opulent banquets, filled with meats, wines, and delicacies, turned from pleasure into addiction, and his waistline expanded to grotesque dimensions. Sources report that in his later years, Henry exceeded 150 kilograms, 330 pounds, requiring special mechanisms to lift and accommodate him, as well as reinforced chairs to support his weight. The king, once admired for his athletic presence, became the subject of whispers and fear, his appearance increasingly monstrous. Leg ulcers emitted a putrid stench that filled his chambers with the smell of death. His garments had to be constantly adjusted to fit a body that seemed to devour itself in decay, and his once handsome and seductive face swelled and became harsh, deformed by disease and the fury consuming him. But Henry's decline was not limited to his body. His mind became a minefield of contradictions, paranoia, and escalating cruelty. The king, who once cultivated loyal friendships, began to see enemies everywhere. Betrayal seemed to lurk in every glance and whisper, and his distrust led him to order the execution of counselors and nobles who had once been indispensable. Fear of conspiracies corroded his soul, and loneliness became a constant companion. Even his wives, who should have been sources of comfort and union, became victims of his unstable temperament and thirst for absolute control. The king's physical decline marched hand in hand with the monstrosity of his tyranny, and those who once revered him for his courage now trembled before his fits of rage. This process of degradation also affected his spirituality. Henry, who in his youth debated theology with scholars and wrote against Luther, became a despot using religion as a tool of power. His own conscience was a whirlwind of contradictions. At times he proclaimed himself chosen by God. At others he seemed haunted by the memories of those he had sent to the scaffold. Many claimed he was pursued by nocturnal visions, that the ghosts of decapitated wives and friends visited his chambers, and that the king, in his feverish delirium, shouted at invisible presences, trying to repel shadows only he could see. The court whispered in secret that the hand of God punished him for his sins, that his rotting flesh reflected the corruption of his soul, and that every limping step was a sign of the fall of a man who had dared to defy Rome and destroy the spiritual unity of his people. The decline also transformed his relationship with power. If in his early years Henry had been able to make decisions with vigor and clarity, in his decadent maturity he became dependent on advisors, easily manipulated by factions vying for influence around his bed. Nobles sometimes allied, sometimes betrayed, seeking to control a king no longer possessing the energy to govern alone. Yet, even debilitated, Henry did not abandon his mask of authority. In public, he still presented himself as the unshakable sovereign, commanding in a firm voice and threatening death to anyone daring to doubt his strength. It was a cruel performance, for all knew that behind the royal attire hid a gangrenous body, a man who had to be lifted and barely endured the constant pain consuming him. At the end of his life, Henry VIII was no longer the radiant prince who charmed foreign courts, but a decayed monster, trapped in his own flesh. His swollen body, festering wounds, tormented mind, and bloody memories painted the portrait of a king who had lost his brilliance and become a dark legend. Even so, in this deplorable state, he retained an aura of absolute fear. No subject dared laugh at his figure. No courtier dared criticize his decline. For Henry, until his last breath, was still the king, and his words still held the power to condemn men to death. Thus ended the journey of a monarch who began as the most athletic and glorious of princes, only to end as a grotesque shadow of himself. His decline was not merely the decay of a body, but a symbol of the corruption inherent in absolute power, which consumes a man from within until he becomes unrecognizable. The seductive prince had transformed into a feared monster, and his legend has endured through the centuries as a cruel testament that not even kings can escape the ruin of body and soul. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at the age of 55 at Whitehall. His end was slow and painful. Historical accounts report that he suffered excruciating pain from wounds and infections, and many believe he died haunted by visions of his enemies and executed wives. His death marked the end of an era of excess and the beginning of dynastic instability. His son, Edward VI, inherited the throne but died young, leaving England plunged into religious and succession disputes. Henry VIII's legacy is ambiguous. He was a king who consolidated royal power and transformed England into a formidable nation, but at the cost of thousands of lives, brutal executions, and a reputation that still divides historians between political genius and monstrous tyrant. And so we reach the end of the terrifying and fascinating story of the terrifying final days of Henry VIII, a king who began his life full of vigor, beauty, and charm, and ended his days consumed by disease, paranoia, and the consequences of his own actions, leaving a legacy of blood, betrayal, and contradictions that still echoes through the history of England. If you were impressed by the intensity of this narrative, imagine how many more details remain to be discovered about Henry VIII and his dynasty. Each decision, each execution, and each scandal shaped the fate of an entire kingdom. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is essential for us to continue bringing stories as deep, controversial, and suspenseful as this one. And it helps YouTube recommend our content to more people who love history and mystery. Also, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most about Henry VIII's final days. Was it his physical decline, his executions, or the intrigues that defined his reign? We really want to hear your opinion. And before you go, don't miss the video appearing on your screen right now. It's even more intriguing and captivating, revealing secrets and scandals about other monarchs you could never imagine. Click and continue this journey with us, because some stories are so impactful that they can only be fully understood by watching until the very end. And so we reach the end of the terrifying and fascinating story of the terrifying final days of Henry VIII, a king who began his life full of vigor, beauty, and charm, and ended his days consumed by disease, paranoia, and the consequences of his own actions, leaving a legacy of blood, betrayal, and contradictions that still echoes through the history of England. If you were impressed by the intensity of this narrative, imagine how many more details are yet to be uncovered about Henry VIII and his dynasty. Each decision, each execution, and each scandal shaped the fate of an entire kingdom. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is essential for us to continue bringing stories as deep, controversial, and suspenseful as this one. And it helps YouTube recommend our content to more people who love history and mystery. Also, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most about Henry VIII's final days. Was it his physical decline, his executions, or the intrigues that marked his reign? We really want to hear your opinion. And before you go, don't miss the video appearing on your screen right now. It's even more interesting and captivating, revealing secrets and scandals about other monarchs you could never imagine. Click and continue this journey with us, because some stories are so impactful that they can only be fully understood by watching until the very end.